welcome. We've got some folks getting settled in here. We'll give them just a second to get those things settled in, find a good, comfortable place for our evening. And for those of you that weren't here for our musical guest, we have a few folks that have been arriving. My name's Brad Mellema. I'll be your MC this evening and tomorrow evening. I am the director of the Grand Island Convention and Visitors Bureau. It is an honor to be here with you this evening and to help with these wonderful Chautauqua events. And again, it is my pleasure to be here at the 2023 Chautauqua, joining us for What Connects Us, presented by Humanities Nebraska and our community partners here in Grand Island. Many people have helped to bring What Connects Us Chautauqua to Grand Island, and many thanks are in order. The Nebraska Chautauqua is presented by Humanities Nebraska with support from Sturr Museum, the Grand Island Public Library, the Johnny Carson Fund at the Nebraska Cultural Endowment, the Greater Grand Island Community Foundation, Hall County Historical Society, Grand Island Tourism, Sturr Museum Foundation, Grand Island Area Economic Development Corporation, Kim and Tom Dinsdale, Kay Fowles, State of Nebraska, the Nebraska Endowment for the Humanities, and the contributors of many other generous businesses, organizations, and individuals that are listed on the inside cover of your program. Let's give them all a round of applause. Also, please welcome Chris Sumrich. Chris was running around here. He is the director of, oh, there he is behind the speaker. Welcome, Chris. Good to have you. Christy Hayek-Carley, Heather Thomas, Erica Hamilton, Liz Makowski, Barbara Grant, and Sherry Lynn Hansen from the HN staff. Glad to have you all here this evening. Also, Karen Higgins, Dory Winitska, Keith Bryson from the HN board, and Leanna Steele, Kim Dinsdale, Taylor Green, Molly O'Halloran of the HN board alumni. Welcome this evening as well. Okay, we want you to enjoy the evening, so please take a moment and put your cell phones and other devices on silent, and please note the Chautauqua programs are a smoke-free environment. Also, flash photography is not allowed. Again, the restrooms we'd mentioned earlier, just down Front Street, a couple of doors down in the yellow building. For those of you who are new to Chautauqua, the first-person style presentations, let me explain just a minute how the evening will proceed. I'll introduce our first guests for the evening, Mr. Mark Twain here in just a moment. Mr. Twain will tell us about himself, and then you'll have the opportunity to ask Mr. Twain questions about his life and views. Following the question and answer period with our historical figure, we will take a short intermission before we meet our second special guest tonight, Ms. Edith Wharton. At the end of the evening, you will have an opportunity to ask questions of the modern day scholars who have portrayed our characters, Mr. Twain and Edith Wharton, later this evening. At this time, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker this evening grew up in Missouri and is quite famous for his travels throughout the country and the world. He's an author, a humanist, commenting on American culture and politics, and has spoken frequently on the Chautauqua circuit. Please join me in welcoming the world's oldest friend, Mark Twain.
Thank you, Ed. I was sorry to hear my name mentioned as one of the great authors. They have the most disagreeable way of dying off. Chaucer's dead, Milton's dead too. So Shakespeare. And I'm not very well myself. But let me tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you some stories, tell you some facts about my family, and then we'll get to that question and answer session. I think it's important I find out what kind of audience you're going to be before I get too far into this. With a show of hands, how many of you always tell the truth? 3 people in the front row. Okay, how many of you never tell the truth? 1 person. Are you telling me the truth now? And how many sometimes tell the truth? Good, good. How many people didn't raise their hand besides this person in the 3rd row? Thank you. Honesty is the best policy. If you tell the truth, you have nothing to remember. How many of you think that's true? Mainly. Yeah. Well, my parents had the first crop of us kids in Tennessee. Missouri was a young state at the time and needed attractions. So they went there and had me. Worked out pretty good for all of us considering. There were 7 of us children, half boys.
Be careful.
I am. How many of you have ever been to my boyhood birthplace? Show of hands, in Florida? Florida. Yeah, Florida. Florida, Missouri. I like telling that to people because it confuses them. Now, the town of Florida, Missouri is about 36 miles west of Hannibal. And when I was there, the population was 100. I made it 101. I had increased the population by 1%. I don't know there's anyone in history that can say the same. Well, maybe one. Yeah, I'm related all the way back to Adam and Eve on my mother's side. And Satan on my father's. That's true, mainly. Yeah. Well, anyway, I was going to say Adam and Eve had many advantages, but I think the principal one was they escaped teething. How many of you didn't understand that? That's okay.
I'm slow.
That's all right. No one is slower than me, believe me. Yeah, and I'm going to get to that too. Anyway, this is the house that I was born in. 420 square feet. And there were 8 of us living there. Kind of cozy, if you know what I mean. We lived there until I was about 4 and a half, and then we moved to Hannibal. Now, show of hands, how many of you been to Hannibal? Good. Did you see my house in Hannibal? Here it is, in case you didn't. It's quite a mansion compared to that other place. Yeah. Now, it was in Hannibal. Well, I should tell you the other maybe later. But it was in Hannibal that I drowned 7 times before I learned how to swim. Once in Bear Creek and 6 times in the Mississippi. My parents belonged to a plan with the town doctor, and it was the doctor's responsibility for $25 a year. Every time I drowned, the doctor would pump the water out of me, pump me full of air, and send me on my way. Yeah. I regretted that many times since then. Now, there were boys whose parents didn't subscribe to that plan. And when they drowned, they stayed that way. Yeah, years later, I asked my mother if she wasn't concerned about me drowning as a boy. She said, not at all. A boy would never drown who was meant to be hanged.
That's terrible.
It's true. How many of you think it's true? I better find out. Good. How many of you think it's not? Good. And how many aren't sure? You're still evaluating. Yeah. So far, this side, it's about the same as this, and this side is much. Are you trying to stay out of the sun? Is that what it is? You're moving around, and pretty soon everyone's going to be on this side of the aisle? Wow, fascinating. Did you make allowances for that when you were setting up? That the sun would be in a particular spot? No? Yeah. Well, anyway, what was I telling you? You said something was terrible. Yeah, my mother. Well, anyway, my mother was asked whether or not she could believe anything I ever said to her because I had a reputation for not always telling the truth. I don't remember my first lie. I was too young at the time, but I remember my second one vividly. I was 9 days old. and I asked someone for a match. My mother told all of her friends that it was like fetching a pail of water out of the well. And when you got the bucket up to the top of the well, you threw out the water, 95% of it. And then what was left in the bucket was pure, right down to the marrow. That's true. Yeah. Anyway, how many thinks that's true? Anyone? Please? Thank you. You're going to be an easy crowd. I don't know what to make of that. Well, let's see. How many of you like to travel? Good, most everybody. Anyone that doesn't like to travel? How'd you get here tonight? Well, I brought a few more pictures. You get into that Mark Twain cave. Anyone go into the cave when you were there? Yeah. All the stories I ever wrote about were true stories. They actually happened, and all the characters in my stories were real people. I was in that cave with Becky Thatcher. Now, that wasn't her real name. Her real name was Laura, but that's another story for another day with a much older audience. But I was in that cave in a large room they called the parlor room, and we had candles to see in the dark, and it burned out, and I didn't really know what to do, so I told Becky those 3 words that every woman longs to hear. Becky, I'm lost. And I was, too. If it hadn't been for Becky, I'd have died in that cave like Injun Joe, but that wasn't really true either. He was really a nice man. How many of you have been to my home out in Hartford, Connecticut? A couple of you. Good, good.
How many homes do you have?
Now I have none. But I have places to go to visit.
Oh.
Yeah, they made that a museum in Hartford. That's a good story by itself. Here's the house that my wife Livy and I lived in. We built this house in 1873 and we moved in a year later. It looks like something. Those of you that have been there, do you know what it is? A riverboat, yeah, steamboats, more specifically. This is called Steamboat Gothic. I had the house built this way to remind me of my days on the river. We had 5 indoor bathrooms in this house, quite the thing of its day, even by today's standards. And I noticed when we moved in, we had $300 left in our savings account at the bank. I told Livy it was on account of the fact that the plumber didn't know about it. Anyone here in the trades, you know what I'm talking about? I always forget to ask until it's too late. Here's a picture of my family, my wife Livy and my 3 daughters, Susie, Jean, and Clara, sitting on the veranda. That's our dog Hash laying on the ground, and I'm the one with the cigar in his mouth. Yeah, isn't that wonderful picture? All my family. How many of you knew that I was also a great artist? Anyone? Yeah, I brought my favorite drawing to share with you. Are you familiar with that long, skinny dog that's low to the ground? The dachshund, what's the other name for it? The wiener dog, that's it. Isn't this a beauty?
You're missing part of it.
I know. I didn't say I was a fast drawer, I'm a slow drawer, but the dog had already turned the corner of the room before I could get the front half. That's true. Goodness gracious. All the silly things. Any of you ever been to Bermuda? You were there? How many of you have heard of Bermuda? Pretty much everyone, yeah. What was the occasion that you were there?
Get away.
Just to get away. Well, it's a great place to get away. What color was the sand? Do you remember?
No, white.
Well, yes, and also pink.
I didn't see that.
A lot of people don't know that. And I was talking to one group of people, and a couple said they had been there for their honeymoon, and they each had the other choice or selection. One said white, the other said pink. I'm not so sure they got to the beach. I used to travel with my good friend, the Reverend Joe Twitchell. It's the mark of a good preacher, one who will travel with the likes of me, especially on a rainy day without a lightning rod. Well, Joe and I went there, and the water was perfectly calm, like something sinister was going to happen. I think they knew I was there. I'm not sure. But the sand is so clean, at that time anyway, I don't know what it is now, but if you twisted your foot on the sand would squeak underneath your foot. Has anyone ever had that experience? One person, two. Good. A lot of people don't go to the beach here, I'm sure. But the sky was the most beautiful shade of light blue, and there were only one or two white tufted clouds against the background of the blue. And I remarked to Reverend Joe, I said, Joe, isn't this heavenly? He said, yes, it is. Take a good look. I'm not sure what he meant by that. I asked Joe if he thought when I died I should be cremated. He said, where you're going, I don't think there's any doubt. How many of you think that's true? Mainly, yeah. One person sitting way in the back. Is it okay? Can you hear me in the back? Do you want to move closer? It's hard to throw things from the back aisle. How many of you have been to Havana, Cuba? Let's see. 5 or 6? Good. Sometimes they have exchange programs. Otherwise, I don't think you can go there unless you live in Canada. It's one of the few advantages they have. Did you get into the museum when you were there? How many of you like museums? Oh, good. They have a museum there in Havana. It's only from about the front of the stage to the stairs, maybe a little smaller. I'm sure of it. But they have the most curious things in that museum. They have 2 skulls of Christopher Columbus. One when he was a boy. And the other when he was a man. I was going to buy them for my home in Hartford, but my wife Libby said I had enough of that stuff already. I've regretted that decision many times too. Yeah, that's true. One of the last times I was in Hannibal was in 1902. I was on my way to receive an honorary degree from the University of Missouri, and when I arrived, I saw a fellow I hadn't seen in many years. I said, how's your wife? He said, I haven't spoken to her in 15 years. I said, that's horrible. How do you account for such a thing? He said, well, I didn't want to interrupt her.
That's true.
Seems to be a little bit of difference of opinion here. A little earlier, we had that incident in the cave. I think it's only fair. I can't help but notice that many of you here today are women. What would we be, sir, if it wasn't for women?
Lost.
We'd be almighty scarce. And my mother was a woman. I'm certain of it. Yeah. Well, anyway, us fellas were talking in this hotel, and we were talking about presents. Now, mind you, we weren't talking about the kind of presents that you wrap with nice paper and ribbons and bows that you give to people. We were talking about the presence of mind. And I remarked that nobody I knew had any. Except for me, of course. Now, mind you, I'm sure how many of you know you have presence of mind, or common sense as it's otherwise known? Sure, most of you. How many of you know you don't have it? 1, 2, not many. How many aren't sure? You're still evaluating. Thank you for your honesty. Yeah, well, anyway, we were talking, and all of a sudden there was a great deal of commotion going on outside the building, and we all went out to look. And across the street there was a 4-story hotel that was on fire. And leaning out of the window on the 4th floor, there was a man screaming for his life. And we all looked at him, and nobody knew what to do. They didn't have the presence of mind, except for me, as I mentioned. Now, mind you, they didn't have those ladders like they have today that go all the way to the heavens. They only went as high as the 2nd-story window. So I hollered for a rope. And a fellow brought me the rope, and I took the end of it, and I threw it to that man and told him to catch it, which he did. Then I told him to tie it around his waist, which he proceeded to do. And then I pulled him down. He made quite a crash. But he at least had a fighting chance. How many think that's true? Not. No. I had to throw the rope twice before he caught it.
You used to say a lot of good sayings.
Who?
Mark Twain.
Mark Twain? Me? I used to say a lot of good sayings.
Yeah, I see him in books.
You see him in books? How many of you like to read? Good. What, have you read any of my books?
Yes. He's making
Well, that's okay. You know, they call those ventriloquist acts. One person looks like they're talking, and it's really the other person that's not moving their lips. Do you know which book you read?
I can't remember.
That's not a title of any of my books. Yeah, I brought a book. Maybe you read this one. You know, it was on the 10th of April of last year that I gave into old age for the first time by mounting spectacles. And on the very same day, I decided to renew my youth for the first time in a long time by mounting a bicycle. The spectacles stayed on. How many of you have read this book? The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn? Yeah, your hand didn't go up. It's not the one you read?
She's the one that read, not me.
Well, you said you saw my pictures in books.
No, I saw all your sayings.
In books?
In books and different publications and so forth.
Well, most of the ones that you see places, I didn't say. You have to.
Your name behind it.
Yeah, now people do that all the time. I had people signing checks, and I didn't write those checks. And that's true. This book. Good. How many of you don't remember all of it? I'm going to tell you just one sentence from this book and save you over 369 pages of reading. When I say that at the high schools, all high schools, yeah. But I'm going to share this with you, maybe. Oh, and by the way, at the beginning of this book, there's a tribute. I'm going to read that to you, and you see if this sounds familiar. They don't have the beginning of the book on the first page. It says, notice. That's important you read that. Persons attempting to find a motive in this narrative will be prosecuted. Persons attempting to find a moral in it will be banished. Persons attempting to find a plot in it will be shot. By order of the author, per G.G., Chief of Ordnance. Anyone have an idea who G.G. might be? Who said that? Thank you. That's exactly correct. General Grant. He's a personal friend of mine. I never called him President Grant. I called him General Grant. A lot of people don't know this, but I fought in the Civil War on the side of the Confederacy. Less than that. 2 weeks. And all I did in the 2 weeks was retreat. And then someone fired a gun. And that was too much variety for me. I resigned. And it's a good thing I did too. It gave the North a chance to win. And General Grant thanked me for that years later. That's true. I helped him publish his book. Anyway, I told you it was on page 312, didn't I?
Not yet.
No, it's not. It's on 309 in this edition. It goes really fast, so are you ready? Here goes. Right is right, and wrong is wrong. And a body ought not to do wrong who ain't ignorant and knows better. Do you like that? Yeah. Thank you. I had a girl in the high school ask me why I wrote the other 369 pages. I told her I was paid 7 cents a word. I'd have starved if that's all I wrote, so I put in a little fluff. How many of you know what I mean? Good. Yeah. Books. I love talking about books. I have a story about going to a bookstore owned by Mr. George Haven Putnam, a good friend of mine. He had the most delightful store. He had used books and new books. And I used to like to go there and browse and converse with him. I went into his store and I handed the clerk my card. I said I wanted to see Mr. George Haven Putnam. He said, "I'm sorry, he's busy today. You'll have to come back another time." I said I would. I was just browsing, and I started out the door and I noticed this big, fat, interesting looking book lying on the table. It was an account of the invasion of England written in the 14th century by a traveling friar. And I inquired to the price. He told me it was $4. I said, "Do you give any discounts to publishers?" He said, "Yes, 40% off." I said, "Well, I'm a publisher." And with that, he wrote on a card, 40% off, not once asking me for any verification or making any comments. Not a smile, blank stares. I tried him again. I said, "Do you give any discounts to authors?" What do you think he said? Yeah, 40% off. That's exactly right. Have you heard this story already? That's correct. 40%, he writes on the card, no comments, no smiles. I thought I'd try him again. I said, "Do you give any discounts to the clergy?" What do you think he said? 40%. That's right, 40% off. I said, "I'm not clergy yet, but I'm studying to be. Will you give me 20% off for that?" Sure enough, he writes on the card, 20% off, and that was all. Well, I felt defeated. I was trying to get a little spark out of him, but I think he was dead. I think maybe, I wasn't sure. So sure enough, I thought I'd give it that last try. "You know, I'm a member of the human race. Will you give me 10% off for that?" This time, something else. He said, 10% off. I said, "Have at it." Still no comments. At this point, I realized I didn't have any money with me. So I handed him another card. I said, "Will you bill me at my home in Hartford?" And I started out the door with my newfound treasure underarm. He said, "Oh, Mr. Twain, hold on. I owe you 40 cents. How many of you had that answer? 2 or 3? That's exactly right. Strangest thing, mathematics. I love mathematics. Well.
Did you ever go back to the bookstore?
Frequently, yeah. I can't afford not to go there. He pays me every time I... How many of you like riding on the train? Thank you. Well, when I was over in Europe in the 1890s, it was the mode of transportation. And the fare for the adult was the full fare, and the fare for the child was half of the adult fare. So I was waiting for this train for 2 hours, and you know, now you don't pay the ticket conductor, you pay some kind of machine that takes your money. I recommend you jump over the gate without paying. I'm too slow to do that, but, well, last week I met someone that was slower. I found out, though, on close examination, he was merely dead, so. I was waiting for the train for 2 hours, and when it arrived, I got on the train, and that train proceeded to stop every 20 feet or every 20 seconds, whichever came first. And after 20 minutes, the conductor came through, and I handed him the half fare. And he looked at the fare, and he looked at me. And he looked back at the fare, and he looked back at me. He said, "I suppose you think you're a child." I said, "No, but I was when I got on." I used to write for the Atlantic Monthly, and I think the magazine is still in existence. Yeah. I traveled across the Atlantic Ocean 30 times, and on my last voyage, even though I was a seasoned traveler, I was pretty upset, my stomach was. A fella came up on deck about midway through the voyage, and he said, "Aren't you the fella that contributes to the Atlantic Monthly?" I used to live next door to Harriet Beecher Stowe. Her husband, Calvin, was a man of the cloth. I had a terrible reputation for borrowing things because I always was forgetting to return them. I had a pile of books on my floor in the room called the library room. Somebody said you should get some bookshelves to put those books on. I said, with my reputation, good bookshelves are hard to borrow. I went next door to Harriet's house to borrow a book, and her husband, Calvin, greeted me at the door. He said I could borrow the book, but I had to read it at his house. He came over to my house the following week, and I got even with him. He wanted to borrow my lawnmower. That's true. Well, we're going to close with a visual. They say the first third of life is a good time, and the rest is remembering it. Life is a fleeting show, as the saying goes, and we all have to go sometime, sooner or later. To go with a clean slate is the main thing. Fact of the matter is, it's the only thing worth striving for. It's life. And like soap bubbles,
That's kind of weak.
just like life, we float upon the world, we float buoyantly, and then we vanish with a puff. Thank you, you're a delightful audience, and now we're going to take some questions.
Could you tell us more about your relationship with General Grant?
Did everybody hear that? Can I tell more about my relationship with General Grant? I can. The first time I met him was at a special occasion in the fall or winter of 1866, before he became president. And it was a big gathering in Washington City. I shook his hand. He really didn't recognize me at all. I was actually working for one of the state senators as an assistant, and that was Senator Stewart from Nevada. The next time I met him was after he became president, and I was escorted down to his office, and I was going to be introduced to Grant. And Senator Stewart said, "President Grant, I'd like you to meet Mark Twain." Or at that time, I was still Samuel Clemens, but some people knew me as Mark Twain. And I was pretty embarrassed about my involvement in the Confederate forces, and I didn't know what to say to him, so I was pretty speechless, which is very unusual. But I said, President Grant, I'm embarrassed, are you? And he smiled a smile that wouldn't do any insult to a cast iron image, and I escaped in the smoke of my volley. I met him almost 10 years later in Chicago on another occasion. And it was Mayor Carter Harrison in Chicago that introduced me on a balcony at the Palmer House. And they were there for a celebration for Grant, and the Army of the Tennessee was recognizing him. I was going to be the featured speaker, the last and final speaker for the ceremony the following evening. And he said, President Grant, I'd like you to meet a man almost as well known as yourself, Samuel Clemens. And he reached across and he shook my hand and he said, I'm not embarrassed, are you? He had the most remarkable memory of any man I had the privilege to know. And later, I helped him publish his book. That's a long story, and maybe tomorrow I'll talk more about it. Not tonight. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes?
Can you comment on your attitude toward the U.S. Congress?
Yeah, my attitude towards the U.S. Congress, can I make a comment about that? Yeah, I'm not very happy with the Congress. I said a lot of negative things about the Congress, but, you know, I said an honest man in politics shines more than he would elsewhere. You remember that one? No.
It sounds good.
Yes.
What was your favorite book that you wrote and why?
Great question. What were my favorite books that I wrote and why? Absolutely, my favorite book that I wrote is Joan of Arc. How many of you have read that book? One person in the far back. 2, 3. Yeah, I wrote that for my 4. I thought she was one of the most remarkable women in history. Here was a woman, 16 years old, that ended a war, a 100-year war that lasted 116 years it lasted. They don't do the math very well. How many history people do we have here? 100-year war, 116 years, right? It does make you wonder. Anyway, she led the French army. It ended the war. She never killed anyone. And what did they do? They burned her at the stake. Not the enemy, the people that she was fighting for. I dedicated that book to my wife, Libby, on our 25th wedding anniversary. She was one of the other women that I thought were most remarkable. She kept me grounded. I called her gravity. And she called me youth, because I was always acting like a child.
Right here. Right.
Yes?
Do you have any nicknames?
Do I have any nicknames? I have a lot of nicknames. Youth is one. Josh was my first nickname that I used. Mark Twain is a nickname. I had another one that I was writing, I was using before that, Thomas Jefferson Snodgrass. I was a river pilot. I wrote 13 stories by that name. That's a great question. I had a lot of other names, and the reason I had to keep changing them, if you know who wrote the story before you read it, and you have my reputation, you might not read the story. Yes?
What makes you mad?
What makes me mad? Pretty much everything. Corruption, hypocrisy, dishonesty. I work hard. When I read something in the paper and I respond to it, you can see the smoke coming off of that piece of paper. And I used to let it sit for a couple of days and edit it a little bit and let it sit for a couple more days, 2 or 3 times, and then eventually there was no more smoke. I didn't even want to send it. Yes?
What are some of your memories of your trip to Hawaii?
Oh, I can remember going down to the... What were some of my memories from my trip to Hawaii? Going to the beach. Yeah, the young nude ladies bathing in the sea, surfing, body surfing. I went down and sat on their clothes to keep them from being stolen. And I stayed there for some time. I wanted to be conscientious about my responsibilities. I would have gone back there, but the last time I did, my wife was on the boat with me and they wouldn't let us land. I think they remembered me.
Can you comment about the war prayer that you wrote in 1904, and did it have any consequences to to your public image?
Yeah, could everybody hear that in the back? About my war prayer story that I wrote, and did it have any consequences? Actually, I was already involved in 1904 as an anti-imperialist. I was one of the regional vice presidents for that political party, and we caused a lot of trouble, and they actually funded that and sent that out, and we changed elections. You know, that was the whole thing. I wasn't in favor of, by the way, I'm getting off track here, but I wasn't in favor of women's rights to vote when I was a young man. And then something happened. I met my wife. And I realized that they had higher moral values and ethical standards than most men. And when they got the right to vote, we would eliminate all the crime and corruption in politics. How have we done? We can do better. And we still have that ability. Yeah, instead of voting for your political party, vote for the best candidate. That's pretty hard to do. Good question. And yes, I had things suppressed by the United States government under the Securities Act. How many of you knew that? One person right there. Devin, hold your hand up high. Yeah, Devin knew that. He's a volunteer here at the grounds at the museum. That reminds me, I met a fellow by the name of Kipling, Rudyard. A lot of people don't know this. Rudyard came to my house and he wanted to interview me. And when he left, I told my wife, Libby, I said, yeah, there goes a remarkable man and I am the other one. Kipling knows all there is to know and I know everything else.
Question right here.
Yes, you've mentioned some of the women that have been influential in your life.
Yes.
I'm wondering what you can tell us about that woman that was very important in Tom's life, Miss Polly, or Aunt Polly.
Aunt Polly. Well, it's based on real people. Yeah. Well, so part of that was my mother, of course. She was the one that made me swear not to swear when I left home. I thought that was kind of interesting, but she would jump up in front of people that were causing abuse and violence against others, and she was a very small lady, but she was not to be deterred. Yeah, Aunt Polly. Excellent. My mother was a big influence on my life. In fact, I talk about it in one of my other writings. When I was back in Hannibal in 1902, I was at the Baptist church, and they asked me to come up to the pulpit and preach. And I was standing at my place in the pew. I said that I wouldn't do that. I preach all week. I don't need to be doing it on the weekend. But she was in the cemetery at the top of the hill, and she is still applauding the things that I do. One last question, and then we're going to take a break. Yes?
Were you acquainted with Thomas Edison?
I do know Thomas Edison. It's funny you should mention that. Yeah, he actually filmed me with one of those silent films. A couple of my short stories were attributed to him, and I have a compliment that's in my pocket. And we were at a function, there was a Carnegie function, and this was circulated. It was the invitation for the evening. And Edison wrote this. He said, "An American loves his family. If he has any love left over for some other person, he generally selects Mark Twain." I was asked once by a reporter if I thought Andrew Carnegie's money was tainted. I said, absolutely. It tain't yours and it tain't mine. And regarding health, another fellow asked me, he said, yeah, do you think, I'm trying to think how he asked the question. He said, is life worth living? And I said, it depends on the liver. Thank you very much. You were a wonderful audience. Thank you. And I'll be back after the next presentation. Thank you.
Portrayed Mark Twain as part of the Freeland 1862 and the Shaping of Modern America, Chautauqua, from 2012 to 2015, which visited Grand Island in 2013. He will be rejoining us for a little question and answer later on this evening. So thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you.